Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a time when smelling like death wasn't a metaphor, it was just normal. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a period of knights' castles and most importantly overwhelming unrelenting nose-searing stench. Like we're talking a time when the concept of deodorant was about as real as dragons and people genuinely thought touching water might kill them. It's going to get pretty grimy, and honestly you probably won't survive this. Not with your old factory system intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I mean it, no pressure. Drop your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I love seeing how far this strange little history community stretches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin by imagining the first thing to hit you as you walk into a medieval town, not the sight of towering stone walls or knights clanking down the street, but the smell. Your nose wrinkles involuntarily. It's not one smell, not really, it's a horrible symphony: rotting meat, human sweat baked into layers of wool, horse manure, decaying vegetables, and the unmistakable tang of urine baking in the sun. The odor clings like a second skin, and you're not even through the city gates yet. The truth is, hygiene in the medieval period was a concept held together by two strings in a prayer. People simply didn't bathe regularly. Most folks, rich or poor, maybe washed once or twice a year. The idea of a daily shower would have been not just foreign but suspicious. Water, after all, had this nasty habit of being filled with disease, or so they thought, and so many believed it was better to not open your pores too often, just keep that dirt sealed and thank you very much. Even the very word clean was different back then. Sure, you might scrape off the visible mud and brush away the crusty bits from your tunic, but there's no bar of soap, no shampoo, no loofah in sight. The closest thing to a skincare routine involved maybe dabbing your face with rose water if you were extremely fancy, or scrubbing with ashes and sand if you were a peasant. The dirt wasn't just on you, it was part of you. Let's not forget the animals: chickens underfoot, pigs waddling through alleys, and oxen leaving fresh gifts on every corner. Waste management didn't exist. People threw their sewage, yes, raw human waste, directly into the streets. That's not just some myth for drama's sake. You'd literally hear shouts of "Guard Lou" from upper windows, which loosely translates to "watch out for the toilet water." Moments later, a bucket of you-know-what would be dumped straight into the alley, and if you were unlucky enough to be walking by, congratulations, you're now part of the ecosystem. And it gets even more delightful. The streets themselves were often made of compressed dirt and straw, soaked in all that refuge. Imagine summer, the sun beating down on these makeshift paths, warming up layers of decomposing filth and creating a kind of low-grade biological weapon. Shoes weren't great either, usually leather flats with thin soles. You felt everything squishing underfoot. The real medieval experience was basically a daily fear factor challenge. Now here's a quirky fact: in some regions people believed that strong body odor was actually a sign of health. You smelled like a working human, and that was a good thing. There were even cases where people deliberately avoided masking their scent with herbs or perfumes because they worried it would make them look vain or worse, sinful. In fact, too much effort toward cleanliness often got lumped in with pride, one of the 7 deadly sins. So you see a guy who's sparkling clean, he's probably up to something. There's actually an ongoing scholarly debate about just how dirty people truly were. Some historians argue that medieval folk weren't as disgustingly filthy as we love to think. That a lot of what we know comes from Victorian-era writers trying to make themselves feel superior. They claim there was some washing, some dental care, chewing on mint or sage to freshen breath, and a few scattered bathhouse that weren't all brothel. Others say that's just wishful thinking, and the truth is closer to the nose-wrinkling nightmare we imagine. Either way, the fact that the debate exists says a lot about how complex the topic is and how much of it still lingers in our cultural nose memory. And the worst part, people got used to it. You adapt, your nose goes blind after a while. The ever-present stink isn't shocking, it's comforting. The familiar bouquet of village life. When a rare traveler arrived smelling of soap or herbs, people were just as likely to recoil as they were to admire. Cleanliness was alien, suspicious, possibly heretical. But let's rewind for a second and imagine you're waking up in a modest medieval home. The air inside is Thick with the smells of unwashed bodies, damp straw, last night's stew, and something vaguely mildewy. You open a wooden shutter, not a glass window, and breathe in a waft of whatever the neighbors tossed out their window that morning. Your own chamber pot needs emptying, and it's your turn. You carry it down the narrow stairs past the fire, where the breakfast porridge is bubbling, probably with insects in it, and you step out into the street. You shout, "Godalo," and hurl the contents into the alley. A goat bleat in the distance, someone's yelling. The smell hits you again and you shrug. It's just another day in the most pungent era in human history. You probably think baths are a basic human right, maybe even a ritual, a hot soak with bubbles, candles, maybe a little music, but in the Middle Ages bathing was something you did so rarely it had to be marked on the calendar, and even then only if it didn't raise eyebrows. You want to clean yourself, great, but not too often, or people start wondering what you've been up to. Bathing wasn't just scarce, it was straight up controversial. In early medieval Europe, public and private baths were relatively common, leftovers from the Romans, who were obsessed with bathing. But as the centuries trudged on, that obsession curdled. By the 13th and 14th centuries, people had begun to see water as more of a threat than a blessing. The logic was weird, but it went like this: opening your skin's pores through hot water made you more vulnerable to disease. In a world where plague and bad air were considered legitimate causes of death, that sounded like a hard pass, so most folks opted out. Maybe they'd splash a little water on their face and hands before mass or dinner out of social obligation, not because they wanted to feel refreshed. Real bathing, the full body kind, was reserved for very specific occasions: religious holidays, important life events like weddings, or actual medical treatment. Otherwise you just marinated in your own oils and hoped no one noticed. Spoiler, they noticed. Even those lucky enough to have access to a tub often used it sparingly. The wooden bath barrel might be dragged in once or twice a year, filled with heated water by hand, bucket after bucket from a pot over the fire. Families reused the same water in turn, starting with the head of the household and working their way down the pecking order. By the time the youngest kid got in, the water was a sad lukewarm soup of soap residue, skin flakes, and questionable floating matter. And yes, that's where the phrase, "don't throw the baby out with the bath water," allegedly comes from. The water was that murky. In wealthier homes there were slightly more luxurious options: portable wooden tubs lined with cloth, servants to fill and empty them, herbs and flower petals added to mask the funk. But even these setups were only used a few times a year, and in castles bathing often meant being wheeled into the kitchen, where it was warm and wet and less of a fire hazard. Nothing screams royalty like sitting naked in a wooden tub while someone stirs stew a few feet away. Public bathhouses were a thing, but complicated. At first they were just places to clean up. Men and women bathed together and the vibe was casual, but it didn't stay that way. Bathhouse quickly became hot spots for gossip, gambling, and plenty of things the church frowned upon. If you were heading to the public baths too often, people started asking questions. Were you just there for the soap or something steamier? In many towns bathhouses were eventually shut down, not for being unsanitary but for being too fun. Quirky fact incoming: some bathhouse actually served food and drink while you soaked. Imagine sitting in warm water sipping wine and snacking on roast chicken, all while half-naked strangers float past. It sounds like a spa mixed with a medieval food court. Totally normal behavior apparently, until the plague hit. Then it was like, wait, are we all just sharing germs and soup water? The idea of communal bathing tanked overnight, and so did any momentum toward routine cleanliness. There's an academic tug-of-war around this one too. Some scholars argue that medieval people did care about bathing and that personal hygiene was more nuanced than we think. They point to bathhouse records, soap making guilds, and even court documents discussing bathing etiquette. Others roll their eyes and point to the sheer amount of filth described in first-hand accounts, complaints from travelers, and laws literally banning people from tossing waste into the street because it kept happening. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle. Some bathed occasionally, most didn't, and everybody smelled weird. Of course some folks were all in on filth on purpose. There were monks and ascetics who believed that denying the body meant saving the soul. These were the people who thought not bathing at all was a form of devotion. Dirt was holy, pain was Cleansing. One famous monk supposedly bragged about not washing his feet for over 40 years, which is an achievement. Sure, but not one you want to smell. Meanwhile, bathing is a luxury kept hanging around in certain circles. Knights, nobles, and even royalty sometimes threw bathing parties with elaborate scented oils, music, and servants standing by with towels, but again these were event statements, not routines. King Louis XIV of France, just barely out of the medieval era, was said to bathe only twice in his entire life. His physicians actually warned against water, fearing it would weaken him. Instead, they recommended linen shifts changed often to absorb bodily impurities, so kind of like a human paper towel system. And when people did bathe, it wasn't always for hygiene. Sometimes it was spiritual. Full body immersion was used for religious purification, especially around Easter and other feast days. There were also ceremonial baths before marriage, which were less about cleanliness and more about symbolizing a fresh start. Washing yourself meant washing your sins, your past, your old life, not your armpits. You standing in that world are maybe lucky enough to find a bathhouse still open in a mid-sized town. You walk in and find a steamy room filled with chattering voices, fogged glass windows if you're lucky, and the constant splash of wooden buckets. There's a strong scent of lavender and rosemary meant to mask the human stew underneath it. You can still detect that core medieval musk. Someone nearby is having their back scrubbed with a coarse cloth. Another person dunks their head under a stream of water being poured from a pot. There's a fire blazing in the corner and a worker is busy stoking it while sweat gleams on their forehead. For a second it feels almost modern, almost civilized. Then you remember you'll probably be wearing the same undergarments for another month, and when you finally step out, towel around your waist, your skin warm and clean for the first time in ages. Someone looks at you sideways, too clean, suspiciously clean. Better watch that one, they probably read books too. So you've bathed miraculously and you're walking back to your home through a narrow medieval alley, the wooden buildings leaning so close you could probably steal someone's bread through their window if you were feeling bold. But your brief flirtation with cleanliness is about to be tested, because this isn't just a street, it's a toilet, a trash chute, and a general purpose filth delivery system, all rolled into one. See, in medieval towns plumbing wasn't a thing, at least not in the way you'd recognize. There were no underground sewers neatly tucked away beneath the pavement, no gleaming white porcelain to whisk your business away with a whoosh. No, if you had to go, you reached for your trusty chamber pot, a ceramic or wooden bowl tucked under the bed or in a quiet corner, and did your business. Simple, private, efficient, until it wasn't, because now you've got a full chamber pot. And where does it go? Out the window. Of course, the technique had a whole ritual to it. Before flinging a day's worth of bodily waste into the street, you were expected to shout something like, "Good Lou," from the French, regard low, or watch out for the water, to warn any poor soul walking by. The problem was not everyone bothered to shout, or they mumbled it, or they just didn't care, which meant walking below windows was a high-stakes gamble. Every single day people learned to hug walls and scurry quickly through alleys. The city wasn't just noisy and smelly, it was dangerous. Now picture this, you're wearing a hooded cloak, it's raining slightly, and as you pass beneath an upstairs window, a splash hits your shoulder. You freeze. You know exactly what just happened, but you don't scream. You don't even look up, you just keep walking, trying to convince yourself it was rain. Maybe it was, probably wasn't. You'll never know. Some wealthier homes had what were called guard robes, a sort of medieval indoor toilet, except the toilet part is generous. It was just a wooden seat with a hole usually built into the outer wall of the house or castle, so the waste dropped directly down into a pit, or if you were lucky, a moat. So yes, mows weren't just for defense, they were also very literal crap-filled mows. Take a moment to appreciate the next time you see a fantasy castle in a movie. Castles also had murder holes, which, contrary to their name, weren't always for pouring boiling oil on invaders. Sometimes they were just architectural features that let guards or servants drop waste from upper levels into the world below. Efficiency, medieval style, and it wasn't just human waste. Everything went out the window: spoiled food, dirty water, blood from slaughtered animals, ashes from the hearth. All of it landed in the same narrow alleyways and mingled into a faded stew that soaked into the dirt roads. Add in the waste from roaming animals, pigs, dogs, horses, and rats, and you've got the kind of environment that can only be described As biologically hostile, but here's the really fun twist: this was normal. Municipal governments, when they existed, tried to manage it. There were laws against dumping waste into the street. Sure, but they were rarely enforced, and even when they were, it was like trying to put a band-aid on a volcano. A few towns did build public latrines or dunk pits, but they quickly filled up and overflowed, and there was no real sanitation system to carry it away. So unless you were living near a river where you could at least toss things downstream and pretend it disappeared, you were stuck with the stink. Now let's not pretend everyone was just gross and lazy. People did try to keep their homes somewhat clean. Floors were often covered in rushes or straw to soak up messes, and those rushes were changed occasionally. Usually when they started to rot or attract too many insects, and by changed we mean someone scooped up the top layer, pushed the rest to the side, and threw some fresh straw over it. Problem solved. Smell neutralized. Sort of a quirky detail here: some upper-class households sprinkled herbs into the rushes on their floors, lavender, rosemary, or chamomile, to help combat the odor, but really that just turned the place into a medieval Glade plug-in, covering up the stench. With a more polite stench, it was like putting a scented candle in a porta-potty, and the smells weren't just passive, they shaped how people lived. You didn't just smell the town you navigated. By it you could tell if you were nearing the butcher, the tanner, or the fisher long before you saw their signs. Your nose guided you like a GPS, warning you of particularly nasty intersections and alleys that doubled as open air bathrooms. Children learned these olfactory landmarks early. It was part of growing up. There's actually an open scholarly debate about just how awful it really was. Some historians believe the descriptions we have come mostly from disgusted visitors, merchants, pilgrims, or diplomats from cleaner regions who weren't used to the urban squalor. Others argue the townsfolk knew it was terrible and just didn't have the means to fix it. They even found records of neighbors suing each other over waste disputes, like your privy overflows into my courtyard and now my chickens are walking funny. Whatever the truth, one thing's certain: medieval cities were an old factory battlefield, and you're just trying to survive. Another stroll down Grope Lane or Shamble Street, both real names by the way, some of which survive today. You breathe through your mouth. Try not to step in anything too warm, and remind yourself that this was home for millions of people over hundreds of years. By the time you get back to your front door, your once clean self is already tainted. Mud spatters your hem, your boots are damp with mystery. You've picked up a new layer of scent, one that clings to your clothes like smoke from a fire, but there's no escaping it. This is just how life smells. And tonight you'll fill your own chamber pot, slide it under the bed, and try to sleep knowing that somewhere above you someone else is about to shout, "God allo." So let's keep walking. You're in the middle of a medieval city now, and it doesn't matter which one, London, Paris, Cologne, or Florence, the scent hits the same. There's a reason even contemporary writers refer to these places as noisome, which is a fancy old way of saying, wow, this smells like a dead goat inside a burning outhouse. And it wasn't just bad, it was constant. From sunrise to sundown, the stink was baked into the very air, woven into the fog, clinging to your cloak. You didn't visit the medieval city with your nose, you survived it with grit and nasal resignation. The layout doesn't help. Streets are narrow and packed, sometimes no wider than an arm's span. The upper stories of houses lean in toward each other, darkening the path below and trapping smells like a giant wooden lung with no exhale. There's no breeze down here. What rises from the gutters stays in the gutters. The buildings themselves are made of timber, plaster, and thatch, materials that soak up moisture, mold, and the breath of everyone inside them. Wood in particular holds on to odor like it's collecting sins, and boy are there plenty to choose from. People live elbow to elbow, whole families crammed into a single room, usually shared with their animals. Chickens wander freely, pigs root under the table, and if you're particularly lucky you might get to share your straw bed with a goat in winter. Warm, yes, clean number. You're starting to understand the problem. It's not that medieval folks were dirtier than we are, it's that there was simply nowhere for the dirt to go. When everyone's living on top of each other, sanitation is less of a personal choice and more of an architectural tragedy. And let's talk about waste, because it's not just in the chamber pots and gutters, it's everywhere. Butchers dump piles of awful animal guts, bones, hooves right outside their shops. Blood runs in little rivulets toward the center of the road where it mingles with slop and rainwater, and forms what might generously be called a puddle. Bakers toss scorched bread, fishmongers scrape spoiled scales into the gutter, and tanners, dear God, the tanners boil animal hides in vats of urine and lime, then slap the leftover sludge onto the street like it's nobody's business. Spoiler: it is everybody's business when it seeps into your shoes. The city stinks because it's alive in the worst possible way. There are no garbage trucks, no sanitation crews, no hazmat suits. There's a vague concept of street sweeping, usually done by someone dragging a branch behind a cart, but it's more ceremonial than effective. It just smears the funk into new patterns, and don't even think about asking where all the animal carcasses go after they die in the streets. The answer is not far, but here's a quirky twist: some cities tried to keep things semi-hygienic. In places like Paris, laws were passed that required people to clean the area in front of their homes once a week. Markets were technically supposed to dispose of waste at designated spots, but enforcement was spotty at best. Most officials were corrupt or busy, and the fines for dumping fish heads into the street were small potatoes compared to the effort of hauling them across town to a stinking refuge pile. Even rivers, those glorious natural drainage systems, weren't safe. The Thames, the Seine, and the Rhine were all tapped out, not just for drinking but also for dumping human waste, slaughterhouse refuse, laundry runoff, and occasionally whole corpses all found their way into the water. The phrase "don't drink downstream" wasn't just common sense, it was a life-saving mantra. Waterborne illnesses like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid were rampant, but since no one had microscopes, people just blamed the air or sin or their neighbors' weird-smelling stew. Which brings us to one of the most enduring debates among historians: were medieval cities always this bad? Some argue that things weren't as bleak as we imagine, that medieval folks adapted to their environment, that the worst conditions only appeared during plagues or famine, and that smaller towns were often cleaner than major trade hubs. Others say that's wishful thinking, like romanticizing a garbage dump because you once saw a bird land on it. The truth is probably a mix. Some neighborhoods may have been better maintained, especially near cathedrals or wealthy homes, but most of the city at Rye, in a way, smell was the ultimate class divider. The rich lived upwind on hills near fresh water or walled gardens. Their homes had higher windows, cleaner floors, and fewer pigs underfoot. The poor, they lived in the stinks front yard. If you were lucky, you had a thatch roof that only leaked some of the time, and a dirt floor thick enough to plant onions in. Forget a backyard, your view was the neighbor's outhouse, and your front stoop was the neighborhood's unofficial dumping ground. And yet somehow people lived, not just survived, but actually thrived. Markets bustled, bells rang, children played hopscotch in the same streets that hosted fish guts hours earlier. The stink was part of the background noise, like traffic today. After a while you just didn't notice it. People developed what we'd now call olfactory fatigue. Your nose gets tired and stops noticing, which, if you think about it, is probably the only reason medieval life was psychologically bearable. Picture yourself walking into a crowded tavern. Now you open the heavy wooden door and get hit with a wave of heat, sweat, smoke, ale, and roast meat. It's like breathing through a damp wool sock. You push your way through the crowd. Someone's singing, someone else is vomiting quietly in the corner. A dog is licking up scraps under the table. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed humans and a faint undertone of mildew. But this is comfort, this is normal, and everyone around you is smiling. You sit down, order a cup of something vaguely alcoholic, and raise your mug with the others. Somewhere a lute starts playing off-key. The stench is part of the soundtrack, now a character in its own right, not invited but never leaving. Now let's narrow things down to a single unfortunate body part: your mouth. Because if you think medieval streets were rough, just wait until you get a whiff of medieval breath. Dental hygiene in the Middle Ages was a strange cocktail of superstition, desperation, and sheer neglect. If eyes are the window to the soul, then mouths were more like the open sewer grates of the face. Teeth were expected to rot. It wasn't if, it was when. By the time someone reached their late 20s or 30s, they were often already missing a few blackened murs crumbling incisors, inflamed gums. It was basically a dental horror film playing in slow motion inside every mouth. Cavities weren't treated, they were endured. If a tooth hurt badly enough, you yanked it or More accurately, someone yanked it, possibly using tongs, maybe without warning, and almost certainly without any anesthetic. You just gripped the chair, screamed into a cloth, and hoped you didn't faint from the pain or the infection that followed. But what really haunts you is the breath. Medieval breath was the kind of thing that could peel paint off a monastery wall. People weren't brushing their teeth with minty toothpaste twice a day. There were no flossing routines, no tongue scrapers, no emergency packs of gum in their purse. If you wanted to freshen up, you might chew on a twig. Literally, certain types of twigs, like those from the neem or miswak tree, have natural antibacterial properties and were used like primitive toothbrushes. People would gnaw one end into fibers and rub their teeth with it. Surprisingly effective in some ways, but still miles away from modern dental care. Some folks rubbed ashes, salt, or crushed herbs on their teeth. Sounds promising until you realize that grit wears enamel down like sandpaper. Combine that with a diet heavy on coarse bread, tough meat, and dried legumes, and your teeth had a life expectancy shorter than most medieval kings. Speaking of diet, let's get into it, because what you eat plays a big role in how your breath smells. Medieval Europeans loved onions, garlic, leeks, and cured meats. That's a lot of sulfur. Add in me ale and the occasional hunk of blue vein cheese, and you're basically building a mouth that smells like a compost heap set on fire. And remember, no refrigeration. Spoilage was common. If something was a little off, you just salted it, stewed it, or doused it in vinegar. Problem solved. For your stomach, maybe. For your breath, not even close. What's more disturbing is how breath was tied to medicine in the humoral system, which guided medieval medical theory. Doctors believed your breath reflected the balance of your bodily fluids. A foul smell might indicate an excess of black bile or a liver crisis. They'd try to fix you with bloodletting imperatives or bizarre mouthwashes made from wine, honey, and herbs. One such mixture involved boiling sage and vinegar and using it to rinse your mouth. Not terrible in theory, but when the alternative is pulling teeth with pliers made for horses, it's your best case scenario. Quirky fact for tonight: in certain circles, mouth charms were a thing. These were little spells or prayers people would recite while holding specific herbs to supposedly drive away tooth pain and bonus smelly breath. You might whisper a Latin phrase while clutching a clove, or sleep with a tiny satch of rosemary tied around your neck. It was like medieval aroma therapy meets desperate superstition. Did it work emotionally? Maybe, or factorially? Absolutely not. There's an ongoing debate among historians about how bad medieval dental health actually was. Some point to skeletal remains with surprisingly intact teeth, arguing that lower sugar intake helped keep decay at bay. After all, they didn't have soda, candy, or caramel fraps. Others argue that any benefit from diet was cancelled out by poor hygiene and rough food. Grinding grain with stone tools often left tiny bits of grit in bread, which basically turned every bite into a dental sand blaster that'll wear down enamel real quick. And if you were unlucky enough to develop an abscess, one of those swollen, painful infections under the tooth, you either suffered in silence or went to a barber surgeon, not a dentist. There were no dentists, yet you sat down, tilted your head back, and hoped the man wielding the metal hook had a steady hand and didn't just come from hacking off someone else's infected foot. By the way, kissing in medieval Europe, not as cute as you think. People did kiss on the cheeks, the hands, and yes, occasionally on the lips, but it wasn't romantic in the modern sense. Courtly love was full of rules and idealization. Real mouth-to-mouth kissing was rare, especially between strangers. Probably because, let's be honest, it was a full sensory experience in the worst possible way. Imagine leaning in only to be greeted by a wave of me breath and visible tartar buildup. That's not sparks flying, that's your soul leaving your body. And yet, just like the general stench of the city, people got used to it. Your breath wasn't judged unless it was extra offensive, like knock a monk out kind of offensive. People weren't walking around doing breath checks. They were too busy not dying from infected wounds and crop failures to worry if your teeth smelled like fermented goat stew. You in this time are doing your best. Maybe you chew a sprig of parsley after dinner or rinse with a bitter herbal concoction, but your teeth are already worn down. One mare is starting to ache and you've been ignoring it, hoping it goes away. It won't. Eventually someone's going to yank it, and your breath somehow will only get worse after the gaping wound is left to fester in the cool medieval air. Tonight you lie down on your straw Mattress mouth dry from the smoky air and mead breath so thick you could slice it and you think maybe tomorrow you'll find some mint or maybe not because honestly what's the point, you've got bigger things to worry about like not catching the plague or getting peed on from a second-story window. Let's talk class because while everyone in the Middle Ages shared the same general aroma of suffering, there were definitely levels to the stink. Peasants and nobles might have both smelled like they fought a mud wrestling match with a dead sheep, but how they got there was a whole different journey, and weirdly enough the lower classes often came out of it a little less gross, at least when it came to actual hygiene. Don't be too shocked. Picture yourself as a peasant. You live in a rural village, maybe an hour's walk from the nearest town. Your house is one room built of ley and daub with a thatched roof that leaks if a bird so much as looks at it wrong. Your floor is dirt, your bed is straw, your air is smoke from the fire pit in the middle of the room, because chimneys are still some fancy new-fangled idea for rich people. And yet somehow you might actually be cleaner than a noble living in a massive stone castle. Why? Because you've got access to something magical, a river. Peasants bathed in streams or ponds, often as part of their daily routine. Washing yourself wasn't fancy or ceremonial, it was just practical. After a hard day digging fields, you'd strip off your grime-caked tunic and splash around in the cold water. Sure, you weren't using organic lavender body wash or exfoliating with sea salt, but at least you were rinsing off the sweat and mud. It was free, refreshing, and nobody was going to lecture you about opening your pores to the devil. Clothes got washed too. Sometimes women would lug garments to the riverbank, beat them on rocks, scrub them with lye or ashes, and hang them to dry in the sun. Was the process rough on fabric? Absolutely. Clothes didn't last long, and most people only owned 1 or 2 sets anyway, but it beat walking around in moldy wool now. Contrast that with the noble class. If you're born into money, you live in a castle or manor, beautiful on the outside, but practically a stone refrigerator on the inside. It's cold, drafty, and damp. The stone walls sweat moisture, mold grows in the corners. The only warmth comes from a fire that fills the rooms with a haze of smoke and the faint odor of charred rat droppings. You think you'd be cleaner because you're rich? Not so fast. Nobles didn't do their own washing. Their clothes were made of fine, delicate fabrics, velvet, silk, brocade, and cleaning them was risky, so instead of washing them they perfumed them. That's right, if a noble's gown started to reek like sour wine and body grease, they just douse it in rose water and call it a day. Over time the layers of perfume and filth created something like scented armor, aromatic from a distance, horrifying up close, and bathing nobles did it, but again rarely. It was a production. They needed servants to haul buckets of water, heat them over a fire, fill a wooden tub in a private chamber, then add herbs and petals for fragrance. It could take hours, so they mostly relied on linen shifts worn close to the skin. The theory was that the linen would draw out the dirt and oils, absorbing them so the skin could stay clean. It didn't work, but hey, linen was cheaper than self-awareness. The result, a noble might go months without touching actual water. When you peeled off their layers, it wasn't so much undressing as archaeological excavation, and the worst offenders were sometimes the most powerful people. Royals were practically allergic to soap. Some rulers, like Queen Isabella of Castile, were said to have only bathed twice in their entire lives, which, while possibly exaggerated, gives you an idea of the era's cleanliness standards for the elite. Quirky fact: some nobles had personal scent assistants. These were servants responsible for maintaining their master's aromatic aura, freshening up their linens with perfumes, holding sachets of herbs under their noses, and even discreetly waving fans to keep their body odor from building into a visible fog. If you're imagining a medieval hype man with a bag of lavender, you're not far off. Of course, all of this filth disguised as finery created a strange kind of social dynamic. Nobles believed their status made them immune to common dirt, both literal and moral. If a peasant stank, it was because they were coarse and lowborn. If a noble stank, it was just the scent of importance. They'd be dripping sweat in velvet robes, their hair greasy under heavy hats, their breath a cocktail of rotten wine, and no one would dare say a word, not unless they wanted to get tossed in a dungeon or worse, invited to court. Meanwhile the peasants were out in the field sweating it out under the sun, washing in cold rivers, changing into their one spare Tunic and sleeping next to their goats for warmth. They didn't smell great, but at least their filth was honest. Functional. No one was pretending. The hay-entered guy with muddy boots was a model of virtue. He was just trying to make it to next Tuesday without dying of exposure or crop failure. There's an ongoing debate among historians about whether the noble classes actually cared about being clean or if they just had a different definition of it. Some argue that wealthier folks did value hygiene, just not in the ways we recognize, like the use of scented oils and elaborate grooming rituals. Others say it was all smoke and mirrors, literally, that nobles wrapped themselves in perfume clouds and stiff lace as a way to master rot. Beneath the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. They wanted to be clean, they just had no clue how. So imagine yourself in that world, straddling the line between class and cleanliness. You've just helped your neighbor wash her linens by the river. Your hands red from the cold water. You return to the village and pass a noble caravan heading through town. The air shifts, cloaks billow, perfumes mix with horse sweat and old wine. You breathe in and realize something underneath all the fancy spices and silks. They stink just as much as you do, maybe worse, and that's the dirty secret of medieval life. Status didn't save you from the stink. If anything, it just gave it fancier shoes. Religion in the Middle Ages wasn't just a Sunday obligation, it was the atmosphere. It filled the churches, the bells, the laws, and even the smells. Yes, believe it or not, religion had a scent. And it wasn't always the comforting aroma of incense wafting through a quiet cathedral. No, it was a mixed bag of burning herbs, wax, moldy stone, rotting relics, and the combined breath of a dozen fasting monks in an unventilated chapel. Heavenly? Not exactly. Let's step inside a medieval church. The first thing you notice isn't the stained glass or the towering arches, it's the air, heavy, thick. It smells like damp stone and candle smoke with a faint undercurrent of old wood and dust that's probably older than your bloodline. If it's a special holy day, they're burning incense, frankincense, myrrh, or something slightly more budget-friendly like dried herbs. It fills your lungs, coats your tongue, and clings to your clothes. It's a smell you associate with salvation, but also somehow mildew. That incense wasn't just for vibes, it had a purpose. Medieval people didn't bathe much, remember, so church services could get, let's say, ripe. Dozens or even hundreds of unwashed bodies packed into a stone room with no windows and no airflow. Something had to be done, so priests swung censers filled with smoking resins through the aisles, masking the BO with holy smoke. It became symbolic, the scent of prayer rising to heaven, but really it was divine deodorant in action. And then there were the relics. Oh boy, every church wanted a piece of the sacred bone, fragments of saints, locks of hair from martyrs, bits of cloth soaked in holy blood. But here's the problem, some of those relics weren't exactly well preserved. In fact, a lot of them were straight up rotting in their display cases. That miraculous odor some pilgrims reported smelling when they visited a relic shrine. There's a chance it was less divine intervention and more the slow decay of a 200-year-old kneecap. People lined up to kiss these things. They'd press their lips to glass coffins, silver relics, or splinters of wood, supposedly from the true cross. You standing in that line are holding a candle and trying very hard not to gag. You're here to receive a blessing, not a bacterial infection. But the air tells a different story. It's musky, humid, and somehow carries both hope and mildew. Monasteries were no better. You'd think places of spiritual reflection would be clean and peaceful sanctuaries, but monasteries were workhouses. Monks spent their days copying manuscripts, brewing ale, farming, feeding the poor, and crucially not bathing. In some orders, cleanliness was considered vanity dirt.